Commander HFY sat in his command chair and looked at the blue planet on his screen with the same feeling he had felt 47 times before: another world to conquer and another species to bring under Caltharian rule. The planet called. Earth looked peaceful from space with its white clouds and blue oceans, but HFY knew that looks could lie. He had learned this lesson many times in his long military career. The intelligence reports about the humans lay scattered across his desk like pieces of a puzzle that made no sense. These creatures called themselves many different names depending on which part of their world they came from. Americans and Chinese and Russians and dozens of other groups that seemed to spend most of their time fighting each other instead of working together. HFY shook his head at this waste of energy and resources. In all his years of conquest, he had never seen a species so divided against itself. The humans had primitive technology compared to the Caltharian Empire. Their fastest ships could barely leave their own solar system, and their weapons were crude: metal projectiles and simple energy beams. They had no shields worth mentioning, and their armor was thick but slow. Most interesting of all, they seemed to have no central government that could surrender for the whole species. Instead, they had hundreds of small governments that argued with each other constantly. HFY picked up a data pad that contained information about human military history. What he read there made him pause for the first time since receiving this assignment. The humans had been fighting wars for their entire recorded history, not just border disputes or resource conflicts, but massive wars that killed millions of their own kind. They had weapons that could destroy their entire planet and had actually used smaller versions of these weapons against each other. This was behavior that no rational species would exhibit. The most puzzling part was how they fought these wars. Other species that the Caltharians had conquered would surrender when defeat became certain. It was logical behavior that saved lives and resources. But humans seemed to have a different approach. The reports showed examples of human soldiers fighting to the death even when surrounded and outnumbered. They would destroy their own equipment rather than let enemies capture it. Some would even attack enemy positions knowing they would die. In the process, Captain Jake Morrison appeared in several intelligence files as an example of typical human military leadership. He commanded something called the Earth Defense Force and had spent his career studying alien contact scenarios. The report said he was considered one of their best tactical minds, but his strategies made no sense to HFY. Morrison seemed to plan for battles that could not be won rather than seeking quick victory or honorable surrender. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez caught HFY's attention because she had written papers about asymmetric warfare. Her ideas involved using civilian infrastructure as military assets and turning non-combatants into resistance fighters. Such thinking violated every rule of civilized warfare that the Caltharian Empire followed. Wars should be fought between soldiers, while civilians remained safe and productive. Sergeant Ben Collins represented the human approach to individual combat. His service record showed a pattern of impossible missions completed through what humans called determination and creativity. He had once held a position against overwhelming odds for 3 days using weapons improvised from farming equipment. When asked why he did not retreat, he said that retreat was not an option because others were counting on him. The psychological profiles troubled HFY more than the technical specifications. Humans seemed to fight for concepts that had no physical reality. They would die for ideas like freedom and honor and justice, as if these words were more important than their own lives. Other species fought for territory or resources or survival, but humans fought for abstractions that existed only in their minds. HFY called up the recommended force allocation for the Earth conquest. High Command had assigned 12 ships, including his own flagship, and expected the operation to take no more than 10 standard cycles. The projection assumed that humans would behave like rational beings and surrender when faced with superior technology and overwhelming force. Looking at the intelligence reports again, HFY wondered if High Command had made an error in their calculations. The communication logs from human military frequencies made for disturbing reading. Instead of discussing surrender terms or negotiation, strategies the humans were preparing for what they called total war. They spoke of fighting in space and on their planet's surface, and even in underground tunnels if necessary. Some discussed plans that would make their world useless to conquerors, even if it meant destroying everything they had built. As HFY prepared his fleet for the jump to Earth, he felt something he had not experienced in decades of military service. Uncertainty crept into his mind like a slow poison. These humans did not behave according to any logical pattern he understood. They seemed willing to sacrifice everything for principles that existed only in their imagination. Such behavior made them unpredictable and dangerous in ways that superior technology could not easily counter. The final intelligence summary contained a quote from a human leader that stayed with HFY long after he finished reading. The human had said that they would never surrender because surrender meant accepting that some beings were born to rule over others. They would rather die free than live as slaves. HFY closed the file and wondered what kind of war he was about to begin. The Caltharian fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Earth solar system with perfect precision. HFY watched his tactical display light up with the positions of 12 warships arranged in the standard intimidation formation. This show of force had worked on every previous conquest, and he expected the same result here. The humans would see the overwhelming power arrayed against them and choose the logical path of surrender. Instead, the first response from Earth came, as a surprise that made HFY lean forward in his command chair. Captain Jake Morrison's voice crackled through the communication system with a message that contained no fear or requests for mercy. Morrison simply stated that Earth would defend itself and invited the Caltharian fleet to try their worst. Transmission ended with something Morrison called the human national anthem playing on all frequencies. HFY ordered the standard demonstration of power. His flagship's main cannon fired a warning shot that vaporized a small asteroid near Earth's moon. The energy release was visible from the planet's surface and should have convinced any rational species to begin surrender negotiations. Instead, the humans responded by launching every spacecraft they possessed toward the Caltharian fleet. The approaching human vessels were a mixture of military ships and converted civilian craft that had no business in a space battle. Cargo haulers flew alongside passenger shuttles and mining ships that had been hastily fitted with weapons. HFY counted over 300 vessels of various sizes heading toward his 12 state-of-the-art warships. It was not a battle, but a massacre waiting to happen. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez commanded a group of converted cargo ships that attacked the Caltharian right flank with tactics that defied all military logic. Instead of trying to fight at long range where they might survive longer, the human ships charged directly at the alien vessels. They used their cargo holds to carry massive bombs that exploded when the ships rammed into Caltharian hulls. Rodriguez's voice could be heard on open channels coordinating these suicide attacks while playing human music that she said would be the last thing the invaders heard. The battle was over in less than an hour by any reasonable measure. Every human spacecraft was destroyed or disabled, and the Caltharian fleet suffered only minor damage to 3 ships. HFY prepared to receive Earth's surrender and begin occupation procedures. Instead, his communication officer reported that the humans were launching a second wave of attacks from their planet's surface. Sergeant Ben Collins led ground-based resistance that turned every human settlement into a fortress. Mining charges became orbital bombardment weapons, and industrial satellites were reprogrammed to ram Caltharian ships. The humans had converted their entire civilization into a weapon system in the hours since first contact. Every factory was producing military equipment, and every civilian was participating in the defense effort. What disturbed HFY most was not the futility of human resistance, but their attitude toward their own losses. Human communication channels carried reports of casualties that would have broken the spirit of any sensible species. Entire cities had been destroyed and millions of humans were dead, but the survivors spoke of these losses as inspiration to fight harder rather than reasons to surrender. The psychological warfare began when human broadcasts started reaching Caltharian ships. Instead of pleas for mercy, the transmissions contained messages designed to disturb alien minds. Humans sent recordings of their music and poetry and stories about their history of warfare. They described battles where humans had fought against impossible odds and sometimes won through sheer determination and refusal to accept defeat. One transmission that reached HFY personally came from a human child who could not have been, more than 10 cycles old. The child explained that humans had been preparing for this day since they first looked at the stars and wondered what else was out there. She said that humans knew they would probably lose but would fight anyway because some things were more important than survival. The child ended her message by saying that the aliens would remember humanity long after Earth was conquered. Morrison's tactical approach became clear as the one-sided battle continued. He was not trying to win in any conventional sense, but was, instead teaching the Caltharians what conquest of Earth would cost. Every human death was calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage on the invading force. They were turning their own defeat into a weapon that could wound alien minds. The humans began using captured Caltharian technology in ways that its designers had never intended. They reverse-engineered alien weapons within hours and modified them to work with human equipment. More disturbing was their willingness to sacrifice their own people to test these new weapons. Human volunteers would pilot experimental craft, knowing they would probably die in the attempt. HFY found himself studying human behavior with the fascination of a scientist examining a new species. These creatures seemed to operate on principles that made no logical sense. They valued abstract concepts more than their own lives and were willing to endure any amount of suffering for ideas that existed only in their imagination. Such behavior should have made them weak, but instead it made them terrifyingly unpredictable. The first day of what should have been a simple conquest ended with HFY staring at casualty reports that made no sense. The humans had lost everything. They possessed and were completely defeated by any military standard. Yet they showed no signs of surrender and were already preparing for the next phase of resistance. Morrison sent a final message that day, promising that tomorrow would be worse for the invaders than today had been. As HFY prepared his daily report to High Command, he struggled to find words that would explain what was happening at Earth. How could he describe a species that treated certain defeat as motivation to fight harder rather than reason to surrender? The humans were teaching him that there were different ways to measure victory and defeat than he had learned in 4 decades of military service. HFY had been documenting human behavior for 7 standard cycles, and each day brought new examples of what he was beginning to think of as organized insanity. The siege of Earth continued, but it was unlike any military operation he had conducted in his career. The humans refused to behave according to any rational pattern, and their actions defied every principle of logical warfare. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez provided the most disturbing example of human tactical thinking when she led a boarding party that captured a damaged Caltharian destroyer. Instead of trying to escape with the valuable prize or use it to attack other ships, Rodriguez ordered her team to crash the stolen vessel into a human military installation while broadcasting what she called classic rock music across all communication frequencies. The impact destroyed both the alien ship and the human base, but Rodriguez's final transmission explained that this was exactly what she had intended. The logic behind this action made no sense to HFY until he studied human military doctrine more carefully. Rodriguez had not captured the ship to gain an advantage, but to demonstrate that humans could take Caltharian technology and use it in ways that would haunt alien minds. The destroyed base had already been evacuated and served no strategic purpose, but the psychological impact of watching humans turn captured weapons against their own positions was profound. Sergeant Ben Collins had transformed the human approach. to urban warfare into something that violated every civilized rule of engagement. He organized civilian resistance that turned every city block into a fortress and every building into a potential weapon. Children carried messages through combat zones while elderly humans manufactured improvised explosives in their homes. The entire human population seemed incapable of accepting the concept of defeat. What troubled Zexhai most was the human attitude toward their own casualties. Collins had established a communication network that broadcast the names and stories of every human who died in the resistance. Instead of these reports demoralizing the survivors, they seemed to inspire greater determination to continue fighting. Humans spoke of their dead as heroes who had chosen their own manner of death rather than victims of superior alien technology. The psychological warfare intensified when humans began sending personal messages to individual Caltharian crew members. They had somehow learned the names and backgrounds of alien soldiers and sent targeted communications designed to exploit each being's specific fears and doubts. A young Caltharian navigator received poetry about the beauty of stars, while weapons officers got detailed descriptions of human children who would never see their parents again. Captain Morrison coordinated these efforts with a strategic vision that Zexhai was beginning to respect despite its apparent madness. Morrison was not fighting to win the battle for Earth, but to ensure that the cost of conquering humanity would be remembered throughout the galaxy. Every human action was calculated to maximize the psychological trauma inflicted on the invading force. The most effective human weapon proved to be their willingness to sacrifice everything for abstract principles. They fought for concepts like freedom and dignity that had no physical reality, but seemed more important to them than their own survival. Zexhai had conquered species that fought for territory or resources or the lives of their offspring, but humans fought for ideas that existed only in their minds. Zexhai began keeping private recordings of human behavior because he knew that High Command would never believe his reports without evidence. He documented cases of humans choosing death over surrender, even when offered generous terms. He recorded examples of human creativity in warfare that turned civilian equipment into military weapons within hours. Most importantly, he captured evidence of human coordination that allowed their entire species to work toward common goals despite having no central authority. The strangest aspect of human resistance was their treatment of captured Caltharian personnel. Instead of executing prisoners or using them for information, the humans tried to educate them about human culture and values. Captured aliens were shown human art and music and literature in what seemed to be an attempt to convert them to human ways of thinking. Some prisoners reported that they began to understand why humans fought so desperately for things that could not be touched or measured. Dr. Lisa Park emerged as a key figure in human technological adaptation when she led teams that reverse-engineered Caltharian equipment faster than seemed possible. Her approach involved using alien technology in ways that its creators had never imagined. She turned medical devices into weapons and converted communication equipment into surveillance tools. Most disturbing of all, she modified, captured alien computers to broadcast human cultural content throughout the Caltharian fleet. The effectiveness of human psychological warfare became apparent when Zexhai noticed changes in his own crew's behavior. Soldiers who had fought in dozens of campaigns without showing fear began reporting nightmares about human children singing songs while their cities burned. Veterans who had never questioned orders started asking why the Caltharian Empire needed to conquer a species that posed no threat to alien territory or resources. Morrison's strategy became clearer as the siege continued. He was teaching the galaxy that humanity represented something new and dangerous. Not dangerous because of their technology or their numbers, but dangerous because they had weaponized hope itself. They showed other species that conquest was not inevitable and that some beings would rather die free than live as slaves. The human approach to warfare violated every assumption that Caltharian military doctrine was built upon. Wars were supposed, to be rational calculations where superior force led to predictable outcomes. But humans had introduced variables that could not be quantified or controlled. They fought with emotions and ideas and dreams that made them impossible to defeat through conventional means. HFY found himself studying human philosophy and culture in an attempt to understand their motivations. What he learned disturbed him more than their military capabilities. Humans had spent thousands of years developing concepts of individual worth and collective responsibility that made surrender unthinkable. They would rather destroy everything they had built than accept rule by beings they considered unworthy. As the siege entered its second week, HFY realized that the humans had already achieved their primary objective. They had proven that conquering Earth would cost more than any rational empire would be willing to pay. Even if the Caltharians eventually won the battle, they would lose something more valuable in the process. They would lose the certainty that superior technology guaranteed victory over inferior species. The impossible began to happen during the third week of the siege, when human forces started achieving tactical victories against the Caltharian fleet. HFY watched in amazement as Captain Morrison's improvised fleet of converted civilian vessels began outmaneuvering alien warships that should have been superior in every measurable way. The humans were learning faster than any species he had encountered and adapting their tactics with each engagement. Dr. Lisa Park had become the most dangerous human on Earth not because of her weapons, but because of her ability to understand alien technology better than its creators. Her engineering teams captured Caltharian equipment and modified it within days to serve purposes that the original designers had never imagined. She turned mining lasers into ship-killing weapons and converted water purification systems into chemical weapons that could disable entire alien crews without killing them. What disturbed HFY most was how Park's teams used medical nanobots as surveillance devices. They had somehow reprogrammed the tiny machines that were designed to heal injuries and turned them into invisible spies that could infiltrate Caltharian ships. The nanobots transmitted detailed information about alien technology and crew psychology back to human commanders who used this intelligence to plan increasingly effective attacks. Morrison's tactical evolution impressed even HFY's experienced military mind. The human captain had started the war with crude frontal assaults, but quickly developed sophisticated strategies that exploited Caltharian weaknesses the aliens didn't know they possessed. Morrison learned to use the alien fleet's overwhelming firepower against itself by positioning human forces so that Caltharian ships would damage each other while trying to hit their targets. The psychological warfare reached new levels of effectiveness when humans began broadcasting what they called their greatest war songs directly into Caltharian command centers. The alien crews found themselves listening to music that spoke of sacrifice and determination and never giving up even when death was certain. Some Caltharian soldiers reported that they could not get the human melodies out of their minds and began humming them during quiet moments. Lieutenant Rodriguez had survived her early suicide missions and evolved into a master of what humans called guerrilla warfare. She led teams that struck at Caltharian supply lines and communication networks using tactics that seemed to change every day. Her forces would appear from nowhere to attack alien positions and then vanish before reinforcements could arrive. The humans were learning to fight like ghosts that could not be pinned down or eliminated. The most troubling development was how humans treated the concept of acceptable losses. Other species would retreat when casualties reached 10%, but humans seemed willing to accept losses that would destroy any rational military force. Entire human units would sacrifice themselves to achieve objectives that appeared to have no strategic value except to prove that humans could not be broken by superior firepower. Sergeant Collins had created something that HFY could only describe as a civilian army. Every human settlement had become a military installation where children learned to make weapons from household items, and elderly citizens served as intelligence gatherers and saboteurs. The entire human species was participating in the war effort with an enthusiasm that seemed to grow stronger as their losses mounted. HFY began to understand that humans did not fight wars to win them, but to teach their enemies lessons about the price of aggression. Every human death was carefully orchestrated to inflict maximum psychological damage on the conquering force. They were transforming their own suffering into a weapon that could wound alien minds in ways that traditional military force could not heal. The human approach to captured technology revealed an improvisational genius that surpassed anything. In Caltharian military databases, they created weapons from farming equipment and turned entertainment systems into military communication networks. Most impressive of all, they learned to use Caltharian energy sources to power human devices that had been designed for completely different purposes. Morrison sent increasingly sophisticated challenges to HFY personally as the siege continued. The human captain seemed to understand that he was fighting not just for Earth, but for the entire galaxy's perception of human capabilities. His messages contained detailed analyses of Caltharian tactics and suggestions for how the alien commander might improve his effectiveness. Morrison was teaching his enemy how to fight better, while simultaneously demonstrating that superior tactics alone could not guarantee victory. The breakthrough came when human engineers successfully captured and reprogrammed a Caltharian communication satellite. Instead of using it to gather intelligence, they broadcast human cultural content throughout the alien fleet 24 hours a day. Caltharian crews found themselves exposed to human music and poetry and stories that challenged every assumption they held about the nature of war and conquest. Dr. Park's greatest achievement was the creation of hybrid weapons that combined human creativity with alien technology. Her teams built devices that could not exist according to either human or Caltharian scientific principles, but somehow worked anyway. These impossible weapons gave human forces capabilities that even HFY's experienced military mind could not predict or counter. The human understanding of psychological warfare reached levels that impressed even their enemies. They learned to exploit specific Caltharian cultural fears and use this knowledge to craft messages that could demoralize alien crews more effectively than physical weapons. Some Caltharian soldiers began requesting transfers away from Earth duty because they could no longer tolerate the constant exposure to human determination. HFY realized that the humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic military history. They had turned their own inevitable defeat into a victory by redefining what victory meant. They were not fighting to save Earth, but to ensure that the galaxy would remember what happened when someone tried to conquer a species that refused to accept conquest as possible. The most terrifying aspect of human warfare was their ability to inspire other species. Intercepted communications showed that other worlds were studying human resistance tactics and beginning to question whether submission to superior forces was the only rational choice. The humans were teaching the galaxy that there were alternatives, to surrender that did not require superior technology or numbers. As the siege entered its fourth week, HFY found himself documenting military innovations that violated everything he thought he knew about warfare. The humans had proven that determination and creativity could overcome technological superiority if the inferior force was willing to pay any price for their principles. They were rewriting the rules of galactic conflict through sheer force of will. The psychological breakdown of the Caltharian fleet began during the fifth week of the siege, when HFY's own soldiers started refusing direct orders for the first time in his military career. Veterans who had fought in dozens of campaigns, without showing fear, now reported that they could not sleep because of dreams filled with human voices singing songs about freedom and sacrifice. The constant exposure to human determination was having effects that no Caltharian military manual had prepared them to handle. HFY found himself studying reports from his medical officers that described symptoms he had never seen before. Caltharian soldiers were experiencing what human psychologists would recognize as guilt and doubt. But these emotions had no equivalent in alien military training. Warriors who had conquered worlds without question were asking why the Caltharian Empire needed to rule over species that posed no threat to alien territory or resources. Captain Morrison seemed to understand exactly what was happening to the invading force when he sent a personal challenge to HFY that arrived during the commander's darkest hour. Morrison requested a meeting in neutral space not to negotiate surrender terms, but to ensure that the Caltharian leader understood what humanity represented before the war reached its inevitable conclusion. The human captain wanted his enemy to know why his species fought with such desperate courage. The invitation troubled HFY more than any military threat because it represented something unprecedented in his experience. Enemy commanders did not usually seek personal contact with their opponents unless they were preparing to surrender or attempting to gather intelligence. But Morrison's message made it clear that he had no intention of surrendering and already knew everything about Caltharian capabilities that he needed to know. HFY accepted the meeting against the advice of his staff because he needed to understand what he was fighting against. The encounter took place on a small asteroid between Earth and the Caltharian fleet, where both commanders could meet without risking their forces. Morrison arrived alone in a damaged shuttle that should not have been capable of spaceflight, but somehow functioned anyway through human engineering modifications. The human captain was smaller than HFY had expected and showed obvious signs of exhaustion from weeks of constant warfare. But his eyes held a determination that the alien commander found disturbing because it reminded him of fanatics he had encountered on worlds where conquest had required the complete destruction of the defending species. Morrison was clearly prepared to die for his beliefs, but wanted to explain those beliefs before accepting death. Morrison began their conversation by acknowledging that Earth would eventually fall to superior Caltharian technology, but insisted that this outcome was irrelevant to the larger purpose of human resistance. He explained that humanity had been preparing for this moment since they first developed the ability to look beyond their own world and wonder what else existed in the universe. They had always known that they would probably encounter superior species, but had decided that some things were worth dying for, regardless of the odds. The human concept of freedom proved impossible for HFY to understand, despite Morrison's patient explanations. Humans seemed to believe that each individual had inherent worth that could not be taken away by superior force or technology. This belief made them willing to endure any amount of suffering rather than accept rule by beings they considered unworthy of authority over human lives. Morrison described human military doctrine as fundamentally different from alien approaches to warfare. Other species fought to achieve specific objectives like territory or resources, but humans fought to demonstrate principles that existed only in their imagination. They viewed war not as a tool for gaining advantage, but as a test of will that revealed the true nature of the combatants involved. The most disturbing part of their conversation came when Morrison explained that humans did not expect to win the battle for Earth in any conventional sense. They were fighting to teach the galaxy what happened when someone tried to chain a species that had learned to dream of stars. Every human death was calculated to inflict psychological damage that would make future conquests more difficult for the Caltharian Empire. HFY began to understand that the humans had weaponized hope itself in ways that traditional military force could not counter. They were not just resisting conquest, but making resistance contagious by showing other species that surrender was not the only rational response to superior firepower. The human example was spreading throughout the galaxy like a virus that infected the minds of potential victims. Morrison revealed that human intelligence networks had been monitoring Caltharian communications and knew about the psychological problems affecting the alien fleet. He expressed what seemed like genuine sympathy for soldiers who were suffering because they had been forced to participate in a war that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of conflict and conquest. The human captain's final revelation was that Earth had been in contact with other species that had heard about the human defense and wanted to learn their techniques. Humanity was being recruited as military advisors, not because of their technology, but because of their understanding of how to make conquest psychologically unbearable for rational species. HFY found himself asking questions that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the campaign. He wanted to know why humans valued abstract concepts more than their own survival and how they maintained hope in the face of certain defeat. Morrison's answers challenged every assumption that Caltharian military doctrine was built upon. The meeting ended with Morrison extending an invitation that shocked HFY to his core. The human captain offered to arrange for the alien commander to witness human civilian life before the final battle so that he would understand what the Caltharian Empire was trying to destroy. Morrison wanted his enemy to see human children, playing in gardens and artists, creating beauty, and scientists pursuing knowledge for its own sake. As HFY returned to his flagship, he carried with him a burden of knowledge that no Caltharian commander had ever borne. He understood now that the humans were not just defending their world, but defending an entire way of thinking about existence that threatened the foundations of galactic order. They represented something new and dangerous that could not be controlled through traditional means. The alien commander faced a choice that would determine not just the outcome of the Earth campaign, but the future of Caltharian expansion throughout the galaxy. He could continue the siege until human resistance was crushed, but doing so would require destroying something precious that might never exist again. Or he could withdraw and accept that some species could not be conquered without paying a price that exceeded any possible benefit. The order to withdraw came from HFY himself during the 6th week of the siege, when he realized that continuing the campaign would destroy his fleet in ways that had nothing to do with military casualties. His soldiers were breaking down, psychologically, at an accelerating rate, and some had begun expressing sympathy for the humans they were supposed to be conquering. The Caltharian Empire had achieved total military superiority over Earth, but was losing the war anyway because the humans had redefined what victory meant. HFY's final report to High Command required 17 revisions before he could find words that accurately described what had happened at Earth without sounding like the ravings of a damaged mind. He explained that the humans had won not by defeating Caltharian forces, but by making the price of conquest unbearable for rational beings. They had weaponized their own suffering in ways that traditional military doctrine had no methods for countering. The withdrawal itself became another lesson in human unpredictability when Captain Morrison broadcast a galaxy-wide transmission as the alien fleet prepared to leave Earth orbit. Instead of celebrating victory or threatening revenge, Morrison delivered a message that would be remembered throughout the known worlds for generations to come. He thanked the Caltharian Empire for teaching humanity what they were capable of when their survival was threatened. Morrison's final words to the retreating fleet contained no hatred or desire for revenge, but rather an invitation for future contact under different circumstances. He explained that humans held no grudge against individual Caltharian soldiers who had been following orders and expressed hope that both species might eventually learn from their encounter. The message ended with Morrison promising that humanity would remember this day as the moment when they learned their true place in the galaxy. Dr. Lisa Park's technological innovations had created weapons and defensive systems that violated known scientific principles but worked anyway through human determination and creativity. Her hybrid devices combined alien technology with human engineering in ways that created capabilities neither species could achieve alone. The implications of her work would influence military development throughout the galaxy for centuries to come. Lieutenant Rodriguez had evolved from a desperate defender into a master of psychological warfare who understood how to turn defeat into victory through sheer force of will. Her techniques for maintaining morale in hopeless situations and converting civilian populations into effective resistance networks became required study material at military academies throughout the known worlds. Sergeant Collins had demonstrated that entire populations could be transformed into military assets if they shared common beliefs worth dying for. His civilian army proved that technological superiority meant nothing against opponents who valued abstract principles more than their own survival. The human example inspired resistance movements on dozens of worlds that had previously accepted conquest as inevitable. Zexhi's personal logs from the Earth campaign became classified documents that were studied by Caltharian High Command for insights into human psychology and military capabilities. His recordings revealed that the humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history by making their own inevitable defeat into a strategic victory that influenced the behavior of superior species. The psychological impact of the Earth campaign spread throughout Caltharian society when returning soldiers shared their experiences with friends and family members. Veterans reported that they could no longer view conquest as a simple matter of superior technology overcoming inferior resistance. The human example had introduced concepts of individual worth and collective determination that challenged the foundations of imperial ideology. Intelligence reports began reaching Caltharian command centers, describing similar resistance patterns. On other worlds that had heard about Earth's defense, species that had previously surrendered without fighting were beginning to question whether submission was the only rational response to superior force. The human virus of hope was spreading throughout the galaxy faster than Imperial fleets could travel. Morrison's prediction about humanity's future role in galactic affairs proved accurate when other species began requesting human military advisors to help develop defensive strategies against technologically superior opponents. Humans were being recruited not for their weapons or ships, but for their understanding of how to make conquest psychologically unbearable for rational aggressors. The most disturbing development from the Caltharian perspective was how human cultural content continued to influence alien populations long after the Earth campaign ended. Human music and literature and philosophy spread throughout the galaxy through communication networks and began inspiring questions about the nature of authority and the rights of individuals versus the power of states. Zexhi found himself unable to return to normal military duties after his experience at Earth because he could no longer view other species as simple obstacles to imperial expansion. He had learned that some beings possessed inner qualities that made them impossible to truly conquer regardless of technological disparities. His reports recommended fundamental changes to Caltharian expansion policy that were too radical for High Command to accept. The Earth campaign marked the beginning of a new era in galactic politics, when other species realized that resistance was possible even against overwhelming odds. Human concepts of individual freedom and collective determination began influencing cultures throughout the known worlds and inspiring movements that challenged established orders based on technological superiority. Morrison's final transmission to the galaxy contained a promise that would haunt imperial planners for generations. He declared that humanity would never again be caught unprepared for contact with other species and would share their defensive innovations with any civilization that requested assistance. The humans were positioning themselves as teachers of resistance and guardians of freedom for less technologically advanced species. The ultimate irony of the Earth campaign was that the Caltharian Empire had achieved complete military victory, but lost something far more valuable in the process. They had lost the certainty that superior technology guaranteed dominance over inferior species. The humans had proven that some things could not be conquered because they existed in the realm of ideas and dreams rather than physical reality. Zexhi's career ended with his voluntary retirement from military service because he could no longer serve an empire that sought to rule over beings who possessed the spark of independence that he had witnessed at Earth. His final recommendation to High Command was simple but revolutionary. He suggested that the Caltharian Empire should learn to coexist with species like humanity rather than trying to conquer them, because the price of conquest was higher than any rational civilization should be willing to pay. The human legacy spread throughout the galaxy, not through conquest or superior technology, but through the power of example and the contagious nature of hope itself. They had taught the universe that freedom was not something that could be given or taken away by others, but something that existed in the hearts and minds of beings who chose to value it above their own survival.